Hello again, 102. In this video, I will go over the second question of Chapter 21 of how the Wilson administration mobilized the home front and what did this mobilization do to American society. It was unprecedented expansion of governmental authority. Millions of men between the ages of 21 and 30 were drafted into the armed services. And the government also forced the conversion of industries and farms to wartime needs. They took over the railroads and in many other respects assumed control of national life, unprecedented in its scope and control. And the War Industry Board was established in 1917, and it soon became the most important of all the federal mobilization agencies. It was headed by Bernard Baruch, who was a brilliant financier, and it had the authority to allocate raw materials, order construction of new factories, and they actually set prices. This is central planning. And Wilson also appointed the Republican Herbert Hoover, the celebrated engineer and business leader who will become president, as we'll see, and he will head the Food Administration, whose slogan was "Food will win the war." Its purpose was to increase agricultural production while reducing civilian food consumption, since Britain and France needed massive amounts of American corn and wheat. And this is a propaganda poster that was issued where Americans would go with wheatless days or meatless days on certain days of the week in order to try to conserve food, and they're exhorted to waste nothing. You must help now and get on board with this war effort. And this was very effective. And they also raised taxes to finance the war effort, but Liberty bonds will be sold, and that will be the big source of government revenue for the war. It guaranteed the purchaser a fixed rate of return, and they recruited dozens of celebrities like Mary Astor, Douglas Fairbanks, other athletes that would help make speeches in vaudeville theaters, extorting the American public to do this as a patriotic investment in the nation and a smart investment in one's own financial future. But really, mostly banks and investment houses rather than individuals will buy $20 billion in bonds. Women joined the workforce. And this is a nice photo here of women welding bombs in munitions factories. And it was limited, though. About 1 million American women participated in the war work, but most of them were young and single and already working outside the home, and most returned to their previous jobs once the war ended. And we'll see that again in World War II as well. On the home front, northern businesses sent recruiting agents into the southern states, which were still largely rural and agricultural, to find workers for their factories and mills. And for the first time, efforts were directed at African Americans as well as whites. More than 400,000 southern blacks, mostly farmers, joined what came to be known as the Great Migration northward, a mass movement that would continue through the 1920s and change the political and social chemistry of northern cities such as St. Louis, Chicago, especially the blues movement that will come out of Chicago because of this Great Migration will be intense. The music that will be developed later in Detroit. Other cities like New York, Philadelphia, a Harlem Renaissance, as we'll see, will end up taking place in New York City. And by 1930, the number of African Americans living in the North was triple what it was in 1910. But there was also opportunity for Mexican Americans. And David Barclay Hernandez had to drop his last name when he enlisted in San Antonio, Texas, because the local draft board was not accepting Mexicans. And in 1918, just 2 days before the war ended, he died in France while returning from a dangerous mission behind German lines. And Hernandez became the first person of Mexican descent in the U.S. Army to win the Congressional Medal of Honor. Even more Latinos pursued economic opportunities created by the war effort. Between 1917 and 1920, some 100,000 Mexicans crossed the border into the United States, and the economic expansion caused by the war enabled migrant farm workers already living in states of the Southwest to take better jobs in factories and mills. But there is still segregation in the military. That will not end until after World War II in the Truman administration, because they didn't believe that they were fit for combat, despite the fact that they had been serving in distinction since the Revolution. And there is also a lot of discrimination faced by any of the newcomers in the North or in the West. They were usually resented, and this is nothing new. Any newcomer in American history is discriminated against, the first generation. Also on the political front, the Espionage and Sedition Acts were passed in those years, and it resulted in a severe loss of civil liberties. President Wilson had predicted as much. Once we lead this people into war, he said, they'll forget there was ever such a thing as tolerance. What Wilson did not say was that he himself would lead the effort to suppress civil liberties, for, as he claimed, subversive forces in the nation at war must be crushed out. And under the Espionage and Sedition Act, Congress outlawed public criticism of government leaders and war policies. The Espionage Act of 1917 imposed penalties up to 10 grand and 20 years in prison for anyone who gave aid to the enemy, tried to incite insubordination, disloyalty, or refusal of duty in the armed services, or interfered with the war effort in other ways. And here's another propaganda poster that is exhorting the public to keep quiet because spies are listening. And Hun, the German, is characterized as a spider spinning an invisible web to catch the stray words of Allied civilians. Most of them were simply critics of the war. Debs, who was a pacifist, was convicted under the Espionage Act simply for opposing the war, and he was sentenced to 10 years in prison, and he'll be there, as we'll see, until President Harding pardons him in the very early 1920s. He told the court he would always criticize wars imposed by the master class. While there is a lower class, I am in it. While there is a criminal element, I am of it. While there is a soul in prison, I am not free. And there were two important decisions just after the war. The Supreme Court upheld the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Schenck is a very famous court case, ladies and gentlemen. It reaffirmed the conviction of Charles T. Schenck, who was the head of the Socialist Party, for circulating anti-draft leaflets among members of the armed forces. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, Jr. wrote the famous unanimous court decision that said freedom of speech did not apply to words that represented a, quote, clear and present danger to the safety of the country, unquote. And that is used going forward to limit speech. Does it present a clear and present danger? If it does, then speech can be regulated or modified. In Abrams, the court upheld the conviction of a man who had distributed pamphlets opposing American military intervention in Russia to remove the Bolsheviks. We actually invaded Russian soil, ladies and gentlemen, in the immediate aftermath of the First World War. Here, however, Justices Holmes and Brandeis dissented from the majority view. The surreptitious publishing of a silly leaflet by an unknown man, they argued, posed no danger to government policy. So as there is the Great Migration in American society, you have women entering the workforce, you have unprecedented government control of the economy going on during mobilization of the U.S. under the Wilson administration in World War I.